Thank you, Saifor, and thank you as well to the director and the staff of VICHCAP for this opportunity to listen to these fantastic presentations and to share some of my own ideas. I think it's a fantastic initiative. I'm speaking to you from Canberra in Australia, which is also Ngunnawal country, the country of the Ngunnawal Aboriginal community. And so it's appropriate that I acknowledge the elders and the leaders of that community, the past, present, and emerging leaders. So I'm a historian by background, and what I'm going to speak about today takes perhaps a longer term view on disasters and epidemics. I don't want in any way to diminish the very sobering losses and the very real impacts on communities, on individuals, and on ICH. But I want to think in the long term about how we survive disasters, how culture and ICH in particular are rendered resilient, and how we understand that process and therefore learn from it. So COVID-19 in the Pacific Islands has not been particularly damaging. We've had very low infection and mortality rates. I'm talking here about the islands rather than Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii, which you can see on the bottom left are certainly centers of infection and mortality. In the islands themselves, there have been just 314 cases and only 9 deaths. That's as of yesterday. The graph on the bottom right shows you, in fact, that Guam, which is the second line below the lighter brown line. So the US bases on Guam have led to, if you like, a substantial proportion of the infection within the Pacific. So we're not talking about direct impacts as an infectious disease of COVID-19 in the Pacific Islands. The major impact has been economic, and especially through the loss of tourism and access to tourism. And so one of the questions that I'm receiving from friends in the region is, so what does it mean now to perform culture that we used to perform in front of tourists for ourselves? How do we use this opportunity to rethink what it is we do, why we do it? I'm interested to think about both the impact that disasters have on ICH in the long term and how ICH has mitigated those impacts. And Juliet sketched that for us. That's the dual nature, if you like, of ICH. But it's very important to realize that while COVID-19 hasn't been particularly damaging in the Pacific Islands yet, these islands have historically lost, some of them up to 95% of their populations due to successive series of epidemics over the 19th century and early 20th century. During the Spanish flu in 1918-19, places like Western Samoa lost 22% of their population and up to 40% of their leaders and chiefs who were at the center of the disease. So these are communities that have enormous experience at surviving and coping with losses that we would find hard to imagine in our communities. And I sometimes think that it's amazing that people have any ICH at all under those kinds of conditions, but they do, and they're enormously proud of it. And so I think we have something to learn from the Pacific Islands. I've been working for many years now with a World Heritage Site, which I think is one of the very few sites in the world that is managed and owned and entirely administered by the Indigenous community, with virtually no input from the state. Now that World Heritage Site, which is called Chief Roimata's Domain near the island of Efate in Vanuatu, was badly damaged in March 2015 by one of the world's largest ever cyclones, a Category 5 cyclone, Cyclone Pam. Interestingly, when I went there with my wife, who works with me, and with the community in May, so just 2 months later, we realized that almost all of the damage was to the tourist infrastructure. So the traditional sites had been very carefully located in ways that weren't susceptible to damage, and they weren't damaged. So the values of the site remained intact. But actually what happened in the process of that conversation was, if you like, a much more interesting conversation with the community about the state of traditional disaster mitigation strategies and the way that those strategies are transmitted as ICH. This is a community that's deeply invested in thinking about, talking about heritage, both in its tangible form and as ICH as well. And so much of what I've learned about ICH, I've learned from working with this community and listening to their reflections. And so one of the questions that was raised in conversation with them, and then in a series of reports that I've been involved with for UNESCO, is whether disasters, and I include pandemics there, are always disastrous and only disastrous for ICH. And in the course of a desktop report, a kind of a literature survey for UNESCO in 2017 on safeguarding and mobilizing ICH in the context of natural hazards, it became quite clear that ICH was not strongly susceptible to most natural hazards, short of massive population loss. And that was a fascinating insight. That led then to a second involvement with UNESCO last year with the Living Heritage entity, working on the defining methodological guidance for the safeguarding of ICH in emergencies. So bringing together the natural hazards and the aspects of conflict together within a single frame, and thinking about how ICH is sustained and safeguarded in an enormous range of threats, ranging from natural hazards through to pandemics, through to conflict. And what struck me, and I think some other people involved in this process, is that it's very difficult to talk about safeguarding if we don't first understand how transmission actually works. How does ICH transmission operate over long periods of time? And how then is it threatened by particular kinds of disaster, particular kinds of conflict, particular kinds of pandemic? So I think we need to model how ICH is actually transmitted within communities and beyond communities, and thus how it's at risk from disaster, and therefore what's required to safeguard it. Now, this slide is a wonderful one from Greg Bankoff, which I'm sure Eric knows well. And it's a slide that came out of a conference, I think, about culture and disaster. And what it shows you, you don't have to read it in its entirety or even understand it. It shows you complexity, okay? The convergence of culture and disaster is an enormously complex area. Culture is complex enough on its own. Disasters are complex enough. Put the two together and you have multiple considerations that you have to bring in to explain how culture operates in the context of disaster. And Greg says, and I'll read it for you, jellyfish, earthquakes, military coups, insurgencies, fortune, and the miraculous are so interwoven into the fabric of Filipino cultures, both in the present and in the past, that attempts to compartmentalize them into discrete domains of knowledge like anthropology or history and deal with their effects separately runs not only the risk of seriously underestimating the dynamics of these societies, but of analyzing them only through the lens of one's own culture. And I think that last part of his quote is really important. And as we're all aware, working with ICH, it's the way in which communities define disaster, the ways in which they understand them and the ways in which they respond to them that should guide us in our responses. So working with, if you like, vernacular concepts, vernacular terms, and vernacular actions. And that has led us in our work in Vanuatu to a much simpler rubric, if you like, than Greg Bankoff's drawing, which boils down to people, place, and story. And this is the rubric that has come out of work with this community in Vanuatu, who wanted ways for themselves to talk about the relationship between world heritage and this enormous importance being placed on materials and sites by UNESCO in Paris, and what they understood to be much more important, which was the ICH that animated and gave meaning to place, to all of that material that the World Heritage Center was so interested in. They wanted ways to understand this themselves and to explain it to others. And so they've really come up with this three-legged stool, if you like, the idea that culture and heritage are grounded equally on the community itself, on people, whether you think of people as individuals or communities or agents, transmitters or transactors, even institutions and states. Okay, so the people and the communities that are the vehicles, the vessels of heritage. Secondly, you have place. And these are the material or the tangible settings, the sites, the environments, the resources, the forest, the settlements as well, but also the objects and the artifacts, the things that are used materially to reproduce culture. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly and most complexly, story. And this is the immaterial, the intangible, the knowledge, the ICH, if you like. All three of those are essential. It seems an incredibly simple rubric, but it's enormously powerful as a way to talk with communities amongst ourselves about the ways in which transmission occurs. And so we've taken that basic model and tried to turn it into something a little more complex, which is this next slide. And this is an attempt to show how transmission happens over time and over space, and therefore how we need to target safeguarding activities. And so on the left-hand side, you can see those three basic modalities, if you like, of culture: the people, the place, and the story. And I've talked to you about the form in which those modalities appear to us, the ways in which people appear as individuals or communities, place, which is both setting and objects, and story as knowledge, tradition, all that is immaterial and intangible. And those three modalities get put together, they get articulated in particular performances or expressions or practices. So these are what we would think of as ICH elements or practices. But their transmission is actually a quite separate process. They are transmitted through performance, but they're transmitted both through space to other groups or within a group, and through all sorts of mechanisms ranging from exchange or trade or theft, indeed, or conquest, and they get transmitted over time. So between generations, or locked in the form of monuments to transmit over time, archival, and that can be anything from books to any kind of mnemonic, anything that reminds people about culture and the past, and of course memory. And that's both individual memory and communal memory. And it's only when we map things out in this way that we can then start to say, okay, what is safeguarding going to do? At what point do we need to be focused on people or places or stories? How are these articulated? Where is the articulation of ICH threatened by a particular disaster or conflict or pandemic? And lastly, how is transmission threatened? And so safeguarding practices at the local level, the national, regional, and international need to be thinking about each of these different components quite distinctly, and about the ways in which they're put together then to understand how culture is transmitted and how it needs to be safeguarded. So that's really all I have to say. It's the framework for thinking about transmission as a challenge and therefore safeguarding as a response. And I think when we apply this kind of model to the COVID-19 experience, actually what we find most threatening in some respects is the threat to access to material, access to places, access to movement around other people, to the settings of performance. And I note that a lot of the examples that people have talked about in terms of the impact of COVID-19 have been instances of people being unable to perform ICH in ways that are meaningful to them. So that, let's not doubt that ICH depends upon and interacts with those material settings and those material objects. And that's all I have to say for now. Thank you very much.